This is lecture number 47 in the series, The ABCs of Communism, and it accompanies the book which will be out at the end of this year, The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2017, which I think is going to be the 12th edition or 13th edition, I can't remember. It'll be number 64, chapter number 64, the text for this material on the Empire Strikes Back against Paraguay. And when we finish these two lectures, this is going to be the end of our Latin American series, which we started a couple of years ago, and on the history of the development of the fight for communism and the communist movement in Latin America. And after that, I'm going to move on to China and what's happened there in the last 30 years. Such a vast country with so many experiments that have been going on in so many different parts of that country that it's going to take a number of lectures and a number of chapters. I'm not quite sure how. So that's where this is going next. Now, let me just stop and say before, I want to start with a little talk about the geography of Paraguay. Because what we're talking about is the Empire Strikes Back against Paraguay. And this is now a landlocked country thanks to the imperialist wars of the last century, as you're going to see this morning. But it wasn't always that way. At one time it had an opening to the Atlantic Ocean through the Rio de la Plata, that vast area that lies between Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay. And what we have up here is an area where a person really, in my day, didn't want to go if they had any political nature to them whatsoever, because if you got picked up by the secret police there, you wouldn't get out. So that's a place where you definitely wanted to have a gun on you, because it's not a place to be when you need a gun and you don't have it. It's so, especially me, if I got picked up there, I know I was going to need it and I'd have to shoot my way out. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Now, in those days, the CIA hadn't yet invented facial recognition software for utilization by the secret police of all these Latin American countries, so they pretty much had to rely on handbills, kind of like you see in that movie, that old movie of Michael Douglas and Kathleen Turner on the Romancing the Stone. You got a picture of little Danny DeVito up there on the wall. But see, all these Cholo thugs, these gringos they all look the same. So you don't have to worry. In those days, you didn't have to worry too much about it. By the way, Cholo is an old and respected term for the Indians of the high Andes. If you get a Collier's or any encyclopedia that's 50 years old or more, you'll see that they'll have a section on the Cholos. Now, the subsequent derivation of Cholo into a different kind of a meaning, was more derogatory, has happened up here with the Chicano population, but that's a subsequent kind of development. Back in my day, it was still a term which was widely used and had not yet become derogatory. Anyway, getting back to the geography here, you want to take a look at this very closely on your map. We're going to start with looking at the eastern region, Paraná. Now, the Ponyo Plateau is in the east of Paraguay, and it's heavily wooded. It occupies 1/3 of the eastern region and extends the full length of Paraguay from north to south, runs up to 90 miles west from the Brazilian and Argentine borders, and there's an escarpment that descends from an elevation of about 1,500 feet in the north to about 600 feet at its southern extremity, and defines the western edge of this Paraná Plateau. So you always know you're on the plateau because you can see the edge of the escarpment. Now, the plateau slopes moderately to east and south. Its remarkably uniform surface is interrupted only by the narrow valleys carved by the westward flowing tributaries of the Rio Paraná. Then we have the northern upland, which is the lower terrain lying between the escarpment and the Rio Paraguay. It stretches westward of the Paraná Plateau. The northern upland occupies the portion northward of the Aquidauban River, or the Rio Aquidauban, to the Apa River, APA, on the Brazilian border. For the most part, it consists of a rolling plateau of about 600 feet above sea level and 250 to 300 feet above the plain farther to the south. Now the central hill belt encompasses the area near Asuncion, which is the capital. Now the topography ranges from nearly flat surfaces to rolling, uneven terrain. It has small isolated peaks here and there and numerous lakes. But these two upland subregions, between these two upland subregions lies the central lowland, which is an area of low elevation and mild relief, sloping gently upward from the Rio Paraguay toward the Ponyo Plateau. The valleys of the west-flowing rivers of the central lowland are broad and shallow. Accordingly, there is periodic flooding with seasonal swamps. Its most conspicuous features are flat-topped hills projecting 20 to 30 feet above the grassy plain. Now, thickly forested, these hills cover areas ranging from a hectare to several square kilometers, or acres to square miles. These are the weathered remnants of crustal rock related to geological formations farther to the coast on the east, and these are called Islas de Monte, or mountain islands, and their margins are known as costas. And finally, we have the Nimbuku Plain, which lies in the southwest corner of the Parnania region, and this alluvial flatland has a slightly southwesterly slope, obscured by gentle undulations. The Tibicuary River, Rio Tibicuary, is a major tributary of the Rio Paraguay and bisects the swampy lowland, and the lowland is broken in its central portion by rounded swells of land 10 feet in height. Now, the western region, the other side of Paraguay, is called the Chaco. Now, the Paraguayan Chaco is subdivided into two parts: the Upper Chaco, Alto Chaco, and the dry Chaco, or Chaco Seco. And that's the western three-quarters of the region bordering on Bolivia. While the Bajo Chaco is the lower Chaco, or Chaco Húmedo. The humid Chaco borders on the Paraguay River. Now, these are vast grasslands, as is much of the rest of the eastern part, where cattle and sheep grazing, as you can see, would be something that would be easily adapted to this kind of a situation. The Paraguay Chaco's western two-thirds belong to the semi-arid tropics, with annual precipitation between 22 and 40 inches. Vegetation being dry, low scrub in the west, higher growth xerophytic, that is, semi-arid impenetrable thorn forest toward the east. The eastern third belongs to the semi-humid tropics, with rainfall between 40 and 50 inches, taller vegetation, a tropical semi-humid forest here and there. A belt about 30 miles in length along the Paraguay River, again, has an evergreen forestation with wetlands and palm trees, and palm tree forest, that is the Bajo Chaco, and the annual evaporation is around 59 inches. The very pronounced dry season lasts from May to October, and a wet season occurs from November to April, when the vegetation turns green and abundant. The soils of the Chaco are very deep, sedimentary soils rich in nutrients, including luvisols, cambisols, retrosols, and are in general very fertile and apt for agriculture and pasture. There is a distinct lack of potable fresh water in most of the Paraguay Chaco, except in the north and west. So the lowlands facing the Paraguay River have insufficient drainage and seasonal flooding, which again increases soil fertility. Now, the prehistory of Paraguay. As in all of the Americas, Homo sapiens initially occupied Paraguay in a primitive communist social order. Given the dates in bordering Brazil, we know the primitive communist people wandered through Paraguay more or less continuously for at least 70,000 years, 70,000. The eastern part of the present-day Paraguay was occupied by the Guarani-speaking people for at least 1,000 years before the Spanish colonization of the Americas. For at least 20,000 years, these indigenous Americans were broad-spectrum, wild resource exploiting hunters and gatherers with a typical band and tribal form of social organization, appropriate for this level of evolution of the arts of production. By Guarani times, 1,000 years ago, each tribe occupied several independent horticultural multi-village communities. The Guarani, the Carrillo, Tapé, Itatine, Guarajo, and Tupi were altruistic and egalitarian in ideological orientation, and inhabited an immense area stretching from the Guyana highlands in Brazil to the Rio Uruguay. The Guarani were surrounded by hostile tribes and they were frequently at war. Ethnographically, they believed that permanent wives were inappropriate for warriors, so their marital relations were loose. Some tribes practiced plural marriage. Those tribes that evolved into chiefdoms often had male chiefs with 20 or 30 wives, whom were respectfully treated and shared freely with visitors. These Native Americans appear to have been ritualistic cannibals, the idea being to absorb the strengths of their most valiant foes captured in battle, in the hope that they would gain the bravery and power of their victims. Now, at the time of white contact, the Guarani accepted the arrival of the Spaniards and initially sought them out as allies against fiercer neighboring tribes. Once they learned of Spanish success against the Incas, they hoped the Spaniards would aid them in their ongoing struggle against the Incas. In contrast with the hospitable Guarani, others, such as the inhabitants of the Gran Chaco, fought the Spanish as another dangerous group of interlopers, specifically the Paraguay, from whom the Spanish derived the name Paraguay, Guaycuru, Mbaya, Abigon, Mocobi, Chiriguano. The European explorers in the Chaco region reported that these natives were capable of running with incredible bursts of speed, lassoing and mounting wild horses in full gallop, and catching deer barehanded. So those reports obviously came after the Spaniards had lost some horses. The first Spaniards reached this territory in the early 1500s as part of colonial expeditions that created the global empire of Spain. They were predominantly young men, as almost no European women participated in these expeditions. They intermarried, therefore, with native women, resulting in a large mixed or mestizo population. These Europeans and their spouses born in Paraguay constitute the Creole population. Their children spoke the languages of their indigenous mothers, or when white or Creole, they were raised in the Catholic Spanish culture. Now, taking a look at the first explorers and conquistadors that we know about, in 1516, Juan Diaz de Solis led an expedition to the Rio de la Plata. Solis died on his way home at sea, and one of his ships wrecked off Santa Catarina Island near the Brazilian coast. Among the survivors was a Portuguese sailor named Alexo Garcia. Now, Garcia was a con man, not an unusual sort of thing in those days. He was one of those imaginative spinners of tales aimed at securing naive European investors for financing his own adventure against the Incas. And in his fighting in the Gran Chaco, he had acquired a working knowledge of the Guarani language. So Garcia fabricated a report claiming to have located a, quote, white king, unquote, to the west of the Gran Chaco, who governed cities of incomparable wealth and splendor. Now, these were the days when there was an immense amount of speculative capital in Europe. Using some of that, for nearly 8 years, he mustered men and supplies, supposedly for a trip to the interior. In actuality, he led several European companions to raid the dominions of El Rey Blanco, the White King, abandoning them, and of course they were never seen again. Garcias did discover Iguazu Falls in one of his investor expeditions, and he did cross the Rio Paraná and arrived at the site where Asuncion, the future capital of Paraguay, would one day be built. The one time he did attempt to cross the Gran Chaco, penetrating the outer defenses of the Inca Empire, he was murdered by his disillusioned compatriots. And so he became another footnote in history. In 1526, the explorer Sebastian Cabot was next attracted to the Rio Paraguay. Cabot was sailing to Asia when contact with white marooned crewmen told him of Garcia's exploits. So he decided that Rio de Solis might provide easier passage to the Pacific, and eager to win the riches of Peru, he became the first European to explore that estuary. Now, Cabot put a small force on the northern shore of the broad estuary and proceeded up the Rio Paraná for about 100 miles. Here he founded the settlement of Sancti Spiritu. He continued upstream another 500 miles, past the junction with the Rio Paraguay, and at this point Cabot turned back. His imagination fired by greed after natives traded him smelted silver figurines they said came from a land far to the west. He was discovering the Inca Empire from the eastern side of South America. Cabot retraced his route. Then a strong force of Agassiz Indians attacked them, and he was rescued by wandering war parties of Guaranis. They also had silver trinkets of the same metallurgical nature. He now knew he had found the route to the riches of what we today call Peru. Cabot renamed the river Rio de la Plata, the River of Silver. Cabot returned to Spain in 1530, and there he hustled Emperor Charles V, and he repeated the kind of fabrications he had heard rumored about because of Garcia, and of course he could report truthfully about his own discoveries, showing the proof. Now Charles denied Cabot the right to this territory, instead gave permission to Don Pedro de Mendoza, scion of a powerful feudal family at court, to mount an expedition to the Plata Basin. The emperor also named Don Pedro Mendoza as governor of what was to be New Andalusia. He granted him the right to name his successor, making it an hereditary fiefdom. New Andalusia would eventually become Argentina. Mendoza was a congenital fool, however, and he picked the worst possible site for the first Spanish settlement in South America. In February 1513, Mendoza built a fort at a locale having poor anchorage on the southern side of the Plata Silver estuary. Here on the inhospitable, windswept, dead-level plain where not a tree or shrub grew, he built Buenos Aires. Its name at that time was Nuestra Senora del Buen Aires, Our Lady of the Good Air. Now this plain was dusty in the dry season and turned into a bog in the rainy season. Worst of all, it was the territory of the Carandi tribe, who were immediately pissed off at the Spanish and declared war. Meanwhile, Juan de Ayolas, who was Mendoza's second in command, had been sent upstream to reconnoiter, and when he returned he had corn. He also had news that Cabot's fort at Sancti Spiritu had been abandoned. Mendoza next dispatched Ayolas to explore a possible route to Peru, and accompanied by Domingo Martinez de Irala, Ayolas again sailed upstream until he reached a small bay on the Rio Paraguay, and this he named Candelaria, and it is the site of the contemporary Forte Olimpo Fort. He left Irala in charge of affairs at Candelaria and continued into the Chaco, and like Garcia's investors, he and his men were never seen again. Another footnote in history. After Mendoza unexpectedly returned to Spain, two other members of the expedition, Juan de Salazar de Espinosa and Gonzalo de Mendoza, explored the Rio Paraguay and met up with Irala. Leaving him after a short time, Salazar and Gonzalo de Mendoza descended the river, stopping at what turned out to be a fine anchorage, and they commenced building a fort on August 15th of 1537, the date of the Feast of Assumption, and called it Asuncion, Nuestra Senora Santa Maria de la Asuncion, Our Lady Saint Mary of the Assumption. Within 20 years, Asuncion had a population of about 1,500. Primarily, these people were to support the trade between the silver mines of Peru on its way to Europe, and Asuncion became the central province of the Viceroyalty of Peru that encompassed a large portion of central South America called La Provincia Gigante de Indias. Spaniards moving northwestwards across the Chaco to found Santa Cruz in present-day Bolivia often settled instead in Asuncion, as did many moving eastward with the original intention of building ranches and or farms in the rest of present-day Paraguay. And still other Spaniards moving southward along the river to refound Buenos Aires were there. So many of the original inhabitants of Buenos Aires got out by 1541, and a lot of them moved on to Asuncion. Well, uncertainties over the departure of Pedro de Mendoza led Charles V to promulgate a cedula, that is, a decree that was unique in colonial Latin America. The cedula granted colonists the right to elect the governor of Rio de la Plata province if Mendoza had failed to designate a successor or if a successor had died. So 2 years later, the colonists elected Irala as governor. His domain included all of present-day Paraguay, Argentina, Uruguay, most of Chile, and large parts of Brazil and Bolivia. In 1542, this province became part of the newly established Viceroyalty of Peru, with its capital city in Lima. Beginning in 1559, the Real Audiencia of Charcas, based in present-day Sucre, controlled the legal affairs of what was now named Rio de la Plata province. Irala's rule set the pattern for Paraguay's internal affairs until independence. In addition to the Spaniards, Asunción's population included immigrants, mostly men, from present-day France, Italy, Germany, England, and Portugal. This community of about 350 men chose wives and mistresses from Guarani women. Irala himself had 70 women. Consequently, his surname fills several pages in the Asunción telephone directory today. He also encouraged his men to marry, so there are many European surnames in the Asunción telephone directory. The peace that had prevailed under Irala ended in 1542 when Charles V appointed Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, one of the most renowned conquistadors of his age, as governor of the province of Gigante Indias. Cabeza de Vaca arrived in Asunción after, you may recall, he had lived for 8 years among the natives of Spanish Florida. Now, immediately after Cabeza de Vaca arrived, the Rio de la Plata province, now consisting of 800 Europeans, split into two warring factions. Cabeza de Vaca's enemies accused him of cronyism and opposed his efforts to protect the interests of native peoples. Cabeza de Vaca tried to placate his European enemies by launching an expedition into the Chaco in search of a new route to Peru. Now, this antagonized the Chaco chiefdom so much that they started a 2-year war against his colony. In the colony's first of many revolts against the crown, the settlers seized Cabeza de Vaca, sent him back to Spain in irons. They returned the governorship to Irala, and Irala ruled without further interruption until his death in 1556. Irala's governorship was one of the most humane in the Spanish New World at that time. Socioculturally, this was the time of transition among the Europeans from conquerors to landowners, and Irala maintained good relations with the Guarani, pacified hostile tribes and chiefdoms, explored the Chaco, and began trade relations with Peru. He encouraged beginnings of a textile industry, and that's the first germinal of true capitalism in Paraguay. Also, he oversaw the production of cattle ranching, the introduction of ganaderismo, large-scale cattle ranching, flourished in the country's grassland-covered hills and meadows, which were the same then as they are now. Now, Father Pedro Fernandez de la Torre arrived on April 2, 1556, as the first bishop of Asunción, marking the official establishment of the Roman Catholic Church in Paraguay. Irala presided over the construction of its cathedral, 2 parish churches, 3 convents, and 2 schools, which marked the official granting of education to the church. However, all of this foreign ideology antagonized the native peoples. In the last years of his life, Irala yielded to pressure from settlers and established the encomienda, a system of slavery. European rich settlers received estates of land along with the right to the labor and produce of native people living on this land. Officially, encomenderos, that is, these guys that got the grants of land, were expected to care for the Native Americans, but the only thing that happened in reality is that the natives were turned into slaves and or serfs, and this system lasted for the next 2.5 centuries. Now we come to an interesting development in South America. It has to do with the Franciscan and Jesuit expansion which occurred over the next 200 years. The Roman Catholic Church, especially the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and the Franciscans, became the de facto bosses of the enslaved and enslaved Indians, and the governors who succeeded Irala were appreciative of their ability to pacify the indigenous labor force. First to arrive, as usual, in Iberian expansion to less developed areas, as in the Far East, were the Franciscans. They came to Paraguay in the 1580s and began founding reservations like missions, they called them, sometimes referred to in the literature as reductions. Most important were Altos Ita, Yagaron, Tobati, Guarambare, Ipanay, and Atira, all founded by 1600. Now, many of these missions were relocated Vietnam hamlet style during the 1600s, forced to do so by indigenous resistance movement led by the Mbaya Indians. The first Jesuits arrived in Asuncion in 1588. You'll note that this is the year of the destruction of the Spanish Armada, which fundamentally reduced Spain's power in the world forever. They founded their first reduction of San Ignacio Guazú in 1609. The church granted Jesuits extensive powers to change the encomiendas system, and this enraged the latifundistas, who were now dependent on a continuing supply of Indian labor, not to mention concubines, because the Jesuits had a new plan for these people that they had before been able to use. Now, in its place and backed up by King Philip's troops, the Jesuits organized about 100,000 Guarani in about 20 reducciones. Reductions were now called townships. Now, this forced resettlement, as set up by the U.S. CIA in Vietnam, for example, did protect Indians from the ravages of slave-hunting latifundista thugs, but placed them under a new form of thuggery, that of Philip and his church. The Jesuits had made much of Paraguay into an autonomous Christian Indian state, and it stretched from the Paraguay-Paraná confluence to the coast and back to the Paraná headwaters. The new Jesuit strategic hamlets were constantly threatened by slave-raiding Mamelukes or Mamelucos, who survived by capturing Paraguayan Indians and selling them as slaves to planters in Brazil. These Brazilian slavocrats had wiped out the native populations near Sao Paulo and turned to Jesuit hamlets in Paraguay for new slaves. The Spanish crown and Paraguayan authorities chose not to defend the settlements with their own troops. The priests had been dependent on Spain for armed thuggery and were not up to the task themselves, and certainly not about to arm their own hamlet slaves. Not until 1639, when the Viceroy of Peru decided to arm thousands of Guaranis on the hamlets, did the Mameluke threat end. As it turned out, the highly motivated native units attacked the Mameluke raiders and drove them off. This victory set the stage for the golden age of the Jesuits in Paraguay. With weapons in their hands, the Guaranis saw to it that they received the benefits of their labor. Higher living standards, protection from settlers, and physical security followed, and naturally the Jesuits took the credit in Europe. But the balance of power had definitely shifted in Paraguay, and the reducciones, with their own bourgeoisie, became quite wealthy, exporting goods and supplying Indian armies. The reducciones had orchestras, musical ensembles, actors' troupes. Virtually all of the profits derived from Guarani labor were distributed back to the laborers, and the system was later praised by leaders of the French Enlightenment. And these are not guys that you would normally praise the Catholic Church for anything. By means of religion, D'Alembert wrote, the Jesuits established a monarchical authority in Paraguay, founded solely on their powers of persuasion and on their lenient methods of government. Masters of the country, they rendered happy the people under their sway, and they succeeded in subduing them without ever having to recourse to force. And Voltaire called the Jesuit government a triumph of humanity. Now, the Paraguayan Jesuits gained many enemies as a result of their success, and during the revolt of the Comuneros of 1720s and 1730s, Paraguayan latifundistas rebelled against Jesuit privileges and the government that protected them. The Comunero revolt was in many ways a rehearsal for the radical events that would begin with independence in 1811. The most prosperous families of Asuncion, whose yerba mate and tobacco plantations competed directly with the Jesuits, initially led this revolt. But as the movement attracted support from poor farmers in the interior, the rich got smart and made alliances. Now, a century later, in 1811, comes independence and home rule. Beginning on May 14th of 1811, Paraguay declared its independence from Spain. Since then, the country has suffered a history of tyranny, and this begins with the utopian regime of José Gaspar Rodriguez El Francia El Supremo, and runs through that of Francisco Solano Lopez and his successors until finally South America's most infamous homegrown Nazi, General Alfredo Stroessner, took the reins. Let's begin with the Paraguayan War of 1865 to 1870. Because Paraguay was nearly destroyed as a nation because of the war Solano Lopez fought against the combined forces of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, known as the Paraguayan War. It ended with massive population losses in Paraguay and the loss of much territory to Argentina and Brazil. An Uruguayan solution emerged in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and that witnessed the nation's ruling classes copying development in Uruguay politically. A two-party Colorado versus liberal, which Blanco political system, which we talked about last time, with the exact same class bases, eventually evolved in exactly the same process we visited in the previous chapter on Uruguay. In a phrase, total Colorado Party rule. This evolved in a unique Paraguayan way when South American homegrown Nazi Stroessner took over until 1989, and subsequently the CIA, representing Gringolandia, took command, and we have ended up, as of the moment, with their hand-picked stooge. Now, going back to the ranch, the internecine war gives way to the Chaco War. In the first 3 decades of the 20th century, there was ongoing internecine warfare between ganadero families, that is, rancher families. By rancher, we were talking about big, huge ranches. Some with interests in bourgeois industry, and some ganaderos not so much. Then Paraguay went to Chaco War with Bolivia over control of the Chaco region from 1932 to 1935, and in those 3 years, 30,000 Paraguayans and 65,000 Bolivians died in that fighting. In a short summary, from 1870 to 1954, 44 different men all came to power by armed seizure and military coups, and all lost power the same way. They ruled Paraguay until, in 1954, General Alfredo Stroessner came to power after taking the helm of the Colorado Party, and he ruled until his death in 1989. Class war has always been intense in Paraguay. Initially, it was based on ethnic affiliation, and as capitalism took hold, it has been caused by underemployment and the enormous economic inequality between the rich and the poor. The latter are the rural poor, the miners, and the urban proletariat. Since the 1989 death of Stroessner, indigenous, mestizo, and white small farmers have occupied hundreds of thousands of acres of land, and on this they engage in subsistence farming, and they are constantly in conflict with the nation's wealthiest families, who are fully supported by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. European settlers and their Indian women, who had long since given up thoughts of returning to Spain or anywhere in Europe, constituted the autochthonous Creole class. Paraguay soon became a colony of mestizos and Creoles. Continued arrivals of Europeans with little or no opportunity in Europe resulted in their intermarriage with the autochthonous Creoles, and from this came the contemporary Criollo elite. There were 2 centuries of colonial life between 1580 and 1811 that we take a look at in your book, but just to summarize this, the refounding of Buenos Aires in 1580 led to the lessening Asuncion in South America. In 1617, the government of the Rio de la Plata was divided into 2 smaller provinces, A, the Governorate of Paraguay with Asuncion as its capital, and B, the Governorate of Rio de la Plata with its headquarters in Buenos Aires. In this reorganization, the ruling families in Asuncion lost control of the Rio de la Plata estuary and became dependent on their class allies in Buenos Aires for maritime shipping. In 1776, while the gringos were in a life and death struggle with their masters in Great Britain, the Spanish crown created the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, Paraguay. This had been subordinate to Lima, and now became a provincial outpost of Buenos Aires. Located at the periphery of the empire, Paraguay served as a buffer state. The Portuguese blocked Paraguayan territorial expansion in the north. Native troops blocked it until their expulsion in the south, and the Jesuits blocked it in the east. The Viceroyalty of Peru, or the Real Audiencia of Charcas, had nominal authority over Paraguay. Madrid was on its way off the historical stage and no longer defended the colony. The Crown of Spain needed to avoid the expense of governing and defending a remote colony that now had little value. The governors of Paraguay had no royal troops at their disposal and were instead dependent on Home Guard militia. These Home Guard militia were colonists who had little use for their so-called mother country. White Paraguayans from the small farmer classes were conscripted into the latifundista militia to serve extended tours of duty away from their homes, and native militias saw little profit in supporting the planter army. In all of this was the continuing labor shortage. Paraguayans claimed that the 1537 cedula, or decree, gave them the right to choose and depose their governors, and the colony, and in particular the Asuncion Municipal Council, Cabildo, earned its reputation of being in continual revolt against the crown. Paraguay's distance from Madrid meant it had little control over important decisions that affected its economy, and furthermore, Spain appropriated much of Paraguay's wealth through burdensome taxes and regulations. The preferred national drink of southern cone bourgeoisie was yerba mate. You may remember that this is one of Che Guevara's things that he missed the most when he was fighting in the hills of Cuba. At any rate, yerba mate was priced practically out of the regional market. Spain was using most of its wealth from the New World to import manufactured goods from the more industrialized countries of Europe, especially Britain. Spanish merchants borrowed from British merchants to finance their purchases. Burghers in Buenos Aires borrowed from Spanish financiers. Businessmen in Asuncion borrowed from porteños, that is, residents of Buenos Aires, and forced into crushing debt were the Paraguayan peones, the peons, the landless peasants of native and white ethnicity. To buy anything, they had to do it on credit at company store prices. Now, independence and the May Revolution in 1811. The French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the subsequent wars of the bourgeoisie against feudal Europe weakened Spain. The monarchy in Madrid no longer had the ability to maintain and control it. Local colonial troops and volunteer militias repulsed the British invasions of the first decade of the 1800s without help from Spain. Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808, however, and his capture of the Spanish king Fernando VII, then putting his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne in Madrid, all triggered the May Revolution in the Rio de la Plata in 1811. Among other effects of Napoleon's victory at Iberia had been the severance of the remaining links between Spain and its colonies. Fernando's Spanish royalists had few sympathizers in Spanish America, but Joseph had none, nor for that matter did the Portuguese royalists, who also fell and fled to Brazil. Without a king, the entire colonial system lost its legitimacy. The local ruling classes seized the moment, and their colonies revolted. And we're talking about the southern cone of South America now. The Buenos Aires Open Cabildo deposed the Spanish viceroy on May 25, 1810, vowing to rule in the name of Fernando VII, but in reality, the May Revolution opened the door to home rule for them, and this in the form of the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata. The Cabildo decided to take further advantage of the moment and do what they had wanted to do for a long time, and that was namely bring the province of Paraguay under its control. These porteños, what they had done was, what they were about to do was going to have far-reaching consequences for the history of Argentina and Paraguay. So news of the revolutionary events in Buenos Aires stunned royalist citizens of Asuncion. Discontent with the Spanish monarchy was put aside because of the much bigger rivalry with the city of Buenos Aires. New alliances would have to be built, and they were. Now, the Argentine porteños chose José Espinola de Peña as their leader for Asuncion. When Espinola arrived in Asuncion, he was greeted with an arrest warrant. accused of participating with former Governor Lázaro de Rivera in the murder of hundreds of ruling class citizens, he barely escaped arrest. Espinola fled back to Buenos Aires, and there he lied about the extent of the Argentine porteño popularity in Paraguay, which was just what the Buenos Aires Primera Junta wanted to hear, and they used this to justify their decision to launch a military invasion of Paraguay with 1,100 troops under General Manuel Belgrano, with orders to subdue Asunción. Royalist Paraguayan troops allied with local militias of a variety of political allegiances and whipped the Belgrano porteños at the Battle of Paraguay and the Battle of Taquari. In the course of all this, the Paraguayans were learning what had happened in Iberia and Buenos Aires, and that Spanish dominance in South America was over. It was they, the insurgents, who now held the real power. Mass confusion in these events led to a military uprising in Asunción on May 14, 1811, and the formation of a power-sharing junta. And on May 17th, there was a public proclamation by the junta which informed people that the ruling junta consisted of Governor Velasco, Gaspar Rodriguez de Francia, and Army Captain Juan Valeriano de Ceballos, who had assumed power. Now, in the half-century that the junta ruled between 1814 and 1817, it evolved beginning with José Gaspar Rodriguez de Francia, who ruled from 1814 to 1840 as the supreme dictator of Paraguay. And subsequent dictatorships were those of Carlos Antonio López, 1841 to 1862, and finally Francisco Solano López, 1862 to 1870. During these 56 years, Paraguay developed in its own unique way, in contrast to some other South American countries. The dictators encouraged self-sufficient economic development, government ownership of most industries, and they imposed a high level of isolation from neighboring countries. All of this aimed at keeping the wealth of both agricultural, commodity production, and that of urban commodity production factories in their own families' hands. The regime of the López family was especially greedy in this regard, insisting on ownership of everything in the production and distribution of goods. For them, there was no distinction between the public and the private sphere, and the López family ruled the country as it would a large estate, much as did the King of Belgium rule huge portions of the African Congo. Now, Francia himself is an interesting character. Full name, José Gaspar Rodriguez de Francia, and he was the boss from 1811 until his death in 1840. He built a strong, prosperous, secure, and independent nation at a time when Paraguay's continued existence as an independent country seemed problematic, at least to Europe. Now, Paraguayan independence was a relatively undeveloped country. Most residents of Asunción and virtually all rural inhabitants were illiterate. University education was limited to the very few rich and the very rich, and very few people had any experience in government, finance, or diplomacy. And hostile neighbors ranged from the warlike Chaco tribes to the Argentine Confederation and the Empire of Brazil, who collectively surrounded the country. Frugal, honest, competent, and diligent, Francia was popular with the lower classes of Creoles and native peoples. Francia understood that he had to build a strong state power, that is, army and police, to save his country and to build a base for permanent independence. His most dangerous enemies were the latifundista elite, and under Francia, Paraguay underwent a social transition that destroyed them. Although the real power initially rested with the military, Francia's many talents attracted support from the nation's farmers, and with this he was able to make the military junta progressive. Francia built his power base on his formidable organizational abilities and his forceful personality. In the Treaty of October 11, 1811, Argentina recognized Paraguayan independence, and in return Paraguay promised a military alliance should Buenos Aires require assistance. This was a clever way of getting what he wanted from the porteño powers that were, without unnecessary entanglements. Francia became indispensable, and Paraguayans soon came to see that their independence was largely because of Francia, and so he became indispensable. Now, by the end of 1811, dissatisfied with the political role that military officers were playing, he resigned from the junta, and from his modest cottage or hut called a chacra at Ibarre near Asuncion, he told visiting citizens that the revolution had been betrayed. And to make Paraguay great again, there had to be a change in government that did not feature a Criollo elite traded for a Spanish-born elite. The existing junta was stupid, weak, and incompetent, so it came to pass that the nation rose up and tossed out the bums and brought in their savior. And it happened this way. Paraguay did face many problems. The Portuguese were threatening to overrun the northern frontiers. The United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, which is what Buenos Aires called itself now, northern Argentina, they started a trade war by closing the Rio de la Plata to Paraguayan commerce, levying taxes and seizing ships. The Porteño government now asked for the Paraguayan military assistance Francia had promised. They wanted it for their first Banda Oriental campaign. When the Paraguayan junta learned that a Porteño diplomat was coming to Asuncion to make these demands in November of 1812, the Asuncion junta asked Francia to take charge. The junta agreed to place half the army and half of the available munitions under Francia's command, so he came back from his countryside home there and took command again in Asuncion. And now, for practical purposes, he controlled the government of Paraguay and thus the entire country. When the Argentine envoy Nicolás de Herrera arrived in May of 1813, he was told that all important decisions had to wait the meeting of a Paraguayan Congress in late September, and Francia placed him under house arrest, so the Porteño had little scope to build support, even though he could and did resort to bribery. However, bribery is a game two can play, and the man on the spot with freedom of movement always has the edge. The Second National Paraguayan Congress was held from September 30th until October 12th of 1813, attended by 1,100 delegates. These men were chosen by universal male suffrage, and the Congress presided over by Pedro Juan Caballero, a Francia loyalist. Congress rejected the Argentine proposal for Paraguayan participation and a constitutional Congress in Buenos Aires, and instead it approved a new constitution for Paraguay on October 12, 1813. This is when the Paraguayan Republic was officially proclaimed, becoming the first republic in South America. For the executive branch, it set up a two-man executive body of two councils. These were initially Fulgencio Yegros and Francia. Now, Yegros was a man without political ambitions. Therefore, he was safe because he represented the nationalist Criollo military elite, but without any kind of ambition to take over himself. Francia was the more powerful of the two because he derived his strength from the nationalist masses. Now, the Third National Congress was held on October 3rd and 4th a year later in 1814 and replaced the two-man consulate with a single-man dictatorship, and this time the Congress elected Francia, declaring him to be the supreme dictator, El Supremo Dictador. Francia detested the political culture of the old regime, considered himself a revolutionary. He admired and emulated the most radical elements of the French Revolution. I think he saw himself as the Paraguayan equivalent to the French Jacobin Maximilien de Robespierre. Francia's policies and ideals were similar to those of Franz Noël Babeuf, the French utopian who wanted to abolish private property and to communize land as a prelude to founding a republic of equals. Poor Guaranis called Francia Caray Guazú, the great señor, the man who destroyed the power of the colonial elite along the way, and in their place he advanced the interests of common Paraguayans. In contrast to other countries in the region, Paraguay was efficiently, honestly administered, stable, and secure. By 1827, Francia's army grew to 5,000 regulars, with 20,000 in militia reserve. His justice system treated criminals leniently. Even murderers were often put to work on public projects rather than sent to rot in prison. Asylum to political refugees from other countries was granted, as in the case of the Uruguayan patriot José Gervasio Artigas we discussed in the previous chapter. Now, he perfected the system of internal espionage, and we'll get on with that as we in the next continuation of this lecture, where we're going to show how this work of Francia's laid the basis for the emergence of a modern capitalist state. So with that, we're going to conclude lecture number 47A, and then we'll continue and we'll finish this business on Paraguay in 47B.